Welcome back to Crime Time, Inc. Today, we're looking at a case that really shook Australia, the backpacker murders. Between 1989 and 1992, 7 young backpackers vanished while hitchhiking. Their bodies were later found in Belanglo State Forest. It's a remote area about 100 miles southwest of Sydney.
It's the level of violence inflicted on the victims that's particularly disturbing. Each one was found face down, hands bound behind their backs and partially buried. The cause of death varied. You had stabbings, shootings, and even potential torture. It wasn't just about ending their lives, it seemed much more personal, almost ritualistic.
Yeah, it's definitely unsettling. And the scale of the investigation makes it even more complicated. Trying to piece together the movements of 7 individuals across vast distances, all while dealing with the media frenzy and public pressure to find the killer.
Absolutely. The case involved multiple jurisdictions. There was this constant flow of tips and potential leads and a lot of dead ends. And then there's the emotional toll on everyone involved. Investigating these kinds of crimes, it takes a heavy toll.
Yeah, for sure. Amidst all of this, one story emerges that really highlights the danger these backpackers faced, the story of Paul Onions.
Paul Onions was incredibly lucky. He accepted a ride from a man who matched the eventual killer's description. During the drive, the man made this sudden turn onto a dirt road and suggested they go bushwalking. When Onions refused, the man pulled out a gun, chased him, and even fired shots. Thankfully, Onions managed to flag down a passing car and escape. His detailed account proved crucial.
It's terrifying how close he came to becoming another victim. But his bravery in coming forward and remembering those details ultimately helped lead the police to their suspect, Ivan Milat. So let's talk about Milat. What can you tell us about him? What kind of person was he?
Well, Milat was a bit of an enigma. On the surface, he seemed ordinary, a road worker with a history of petty crime and traffic violations. But beneath that facade was a dark side. He had a previous acquittal on rape charges, which always raises questions. He was known as a loner, a bit of a control freak with this unnerving fascination with guns and knives. Even his own family members suspected him of criminal activity, but maintained this code of silence.
That silence is truly disturbing. Imagine knowing or suspecting that someone close to you might be capable of such horrific acts, but choosing to stay quiet. It speaks to this complex web of loyalty, fear, and perhaps even denial.
It certainly adds another layer to the already complex narrative of this case. But the police weren't relying solely on rumors and suspicions. The search of Milat's home turned up a treasure trove of evidence. Components of a .22 caliber rifle consistent with the murder weapon, camping equipment belonging to the victims, and even maps of Belanglo State Forest, with markings indicating where the bodies were found.
It's like he was keeping trophies, reminders of his terrible deeds.
It's difficult to comprehend the mindset of someone who could commit such acts and then hold on to these objects. It suggests a level of detachment, a lack of remorse that is truly chilling. Each item was meticulously cataloged, each one telling a story of a life cut short. Among the most damning evidence was a backpack belonging to one of the victims. Inside, investigators found a blood-stained section that had been cut out and replaced with a patch. Forensic testing revealed that the blood belonged to another victim.
So he wasn't just randomly discarding these items. He was keeping them, almost curating a collection of his crimes. I can't even imagine what the victims' families must have felt when they learned about this.
The impact on the families was immeasurable. Imagine losing a loved one in such a horrific way, knowing they suffered, and then to discover that their belongings were kept as trophies by their killer. It's an unimaginable level of grief and trauma. One of the victim's fathers, after seeing the evidence presented at trial, said he wanted to tear Milat apart with his bare hands.
It's understandable. It's hard to even fathom the pain and anger they must have experienced. But let's get back to the trial itself.
Milat maintained his innocence throughout the trial, claiming he was being framed a victim of a grand conspiracy. But the evidence against him was overwhelming.
It sounds like it. And what about Milat's family? Did they testify?
Yes, several of his family members were called to the stand, including his brother Richard. Richard was initially a suspect due to his knowledge of the area and access to firearms. However, he was ultimately ruled out, though his testimony painted a disturbing picture of Ivan's personality and behavior.
So even his own brother couldn't provide him with an alibi.
That's correct. The prosecution built a strong case, relying on forensic evidence, witness testimonies, and Paul Onions' harrowing account of his encounter with Milat.
And in the end, what was the verdict?
In 1996, Milat was found guilty on all 7 counts of murder and sentenced to 7 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. He was sent to Goulburn Correctional Centre, a maximum security prison in New South Wales, where he spent the rest of his life.
So justice was served, at least in the legal sense. But I imagine there were still a lot of unanswered questions, a sense that the full story hadn't been told.
Absolutely. Even with Milat behind bars, the case continued to generate speculation and raise troubling questions. Some believe his victim count is far higher than 7, pointing to unsolved murders with similar characteristics. The details of these crimes are often eerily similar. Young travelers vanishing while hitchhiking their bodies found in remote areas, often with signs of torture.
It's a terrifying thought that there might be more victims out there, more families who have endured years of uncertainty and pain, not knowing what happened to their loved ones.
And the speculation doesn't stop there. Some believe he had accomplices, particularly his brother Richard. The idea that he might not have acted alone adds another layer of complexity and horror to the case.
What's particularly striking is the fact that Milat never confessed to any of the murders. He took his secrets to the grave, dying in prison in 2019 from esophageal cancer.
His refusal to confess is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire case. It's a final act of cruelty, a denial of closure for the families of the victims, and a reminder that some questions may never be answered.
It's a reminder that some evil is so profound, so inexplicable, that it defies our attempts to understand it.
Yeah, it's a difficult truth to confront, but even as we grapple with the unanswered questions, it's crucial to remember the victims, to honor their memories by understanding the details of their stories.
You're absolutely right. These weren't just statistics. They were individuals with dreams, aspirations, and families who loved them. Let's take some time to talk about them, starting with Deborah Everest and James Gibson.
Deborah and James, a young Australian couple, were just 19 years old when their lives were cut short in 1989. They were last seen leaving a Sydney hostel, planning to hitchhike to a music festival near Albury. Sadly, their journey ended tragically in Belanglo State Forest.
What can you tell us about their case, about the specific details of what happened to them?
Their remains were found years later in 1993, and the forensic evidence painted a grim picture. James was found in a fetal position, his spine severed by multiple stab wounds. Deborah had been savagely beaten, her skull fractured and jaw broken. It's a testament to the brutality of the attack and the level of rage directed at them.
It's heartbreaking to imagine the terror they must have experienced, and to think their remains lay undiscovered for years. Their families left wondering what had become of them.
The waiting, the not knowing, is often the hardest part for families of missing persons. And in this case, the discovery of their bodies only confirmed their worst fears.
Let's move on to Simone Schmidl, another young backpacker who vanished while traveling through Australia.
Simone, a 20-year-old from Germany, was last seen in Sydney in January 1991. She was hoping to meet her mother in Melbourne. Like Deborah and James, she was relying on hitchhiking to get around. Her remains were also found in Belanglo Forest in 1993. She had been stabbed multiple times, her spine severed in a manner similar to James Gibson.
It's disturbing to see this pattern emerging. This targeting of young, vulnerable travelers who trusted the wrong person.
Exactly. And this pattern becomes even more evident with the case of Gabor Neugebauer and Anja Habschied, a German couple in their early 20s who vanished just after Christmas in 1991.
What can you tell us about their disappearance?
Gabor and Anja were last seen leaving their hostel in King's Cross, Sydney. With plans to hitchhike to Adelaide and Darwin, they were excited about their journey, eager to explore the Australian outback. Sadly, their adventure was cut short. Their bodies were found in Belanglo Forest in 1993. The details of their deaths are particularly disturbing. Anja had been decapitated, her head never recovered, while Gabor had been bound and shot 6 times in the head.
The level of violence in this case is just unimaginable. It seems to escalate with each victim.
It's a chilling progression, and it's difficult to say for certain what motivated such brutality. Some experts believe that Milat derived pleasure from the suffering of his victims, that he was driven by this sadistic need to exert power and control.
That's a terrifying thought. And it makes you wonder how someone could reach that level of depravity.
It's a question that has haunted criminologists and forensic psychologists for decades. There's no easy answer, no single explanation that can fully account for such monstrous acts.
Let's talk about the final 2 victims. Joanne Walters and Caroline Clark, 2 British backpackers who disappeared in April 1992. Their story is particularly significant because their remains were the first to be discovered in Belanglo Forest, leading to the unraveling of this horrific case.
Joanne and Caroline were last seen in King's Cross planning to hitchhike to Victoria for fruit-picking work. Their disappearance initially sparked a missing persons investigation, but the discovery of their bodies in September 1992 transformed it into a full-blown murder inquiry.
What can you tell us about the state of their remains and the evidence found at the scene?
The details are gruesome, but important to understanding the extent of Milat's crimes. Joanne had been stabbed multiple times her body, showing signs of a frenzied attack. Caroline had been shot 10 times in the head execution style. The sheer number of wounds suggested a level of rage and cruelty that was almost beyond comprehension.
It's hard to even process those details. And to think that these were young women full of life and dreams whose journeys were cut short in such a brutal way.
Their deaths sent shockwaves through Australia and the international backpacking community. The realization that a serial killer was targeting travelers in such a calculated and merciless manner sparked widespread fear and led to a reevaluation of safety measures for backpackers.
It's a sobering reminder that even in seemingly idyllic places, danger can lurk in the shadows. And it makes you wonder how someone like Milat, someone capable of such horrific acts, could blend into society so seamlessly.
That's one of the most unsettling aspects of this case. Milat wasn't some monstrous figure lurking in the darkness. He was a seemingly ordinary man who held a steady job, interacted with his community, and managed to conceal his dark side from those around him.
It's a chilling reminder that evil can wear a familiar face, that the most dangerous predators are often those who appear the most harmless.
Yeah, it's a terrifying thought. And it makes the case all the more unsettling. We've talked about the victims and the evidence, but let's go back to Milat himself. What can you tell us about his psychology? What drove him to commit these horrific acts?
Well, that's a question that has puzzled experts for years. There's no single definitive answer, but we can glean some insights from his behavior and the nature of his crimes. The meticulous way he planned and executed the murders, the control he exerted over his victims, the fact that he kept souvenirs, all of this suggests a deep-seated need for power and domination.
Yeah, it's almost as if he was playing this twisted game, treating human lives as mere pawns in his own sick fantasy. Some psychologists have suggested that Milat may have suffered from a personality disorder, one that's characterized by a lack of empathy, remorse, and a disregard for social norms. Others have pointed to his troubled childhood, marked by violence and neglect, as a potential contributing factor. But it's important to remember that these are just theories, attempts to make sense of the senseless.
Right. It's human nature to try to find an explanation to understand why someone would do something so horrific. But sometimes there simply is no rational explanation.
Exactly. And in Milat's case, the lack of a clear motive makes his crimes all the more disturbing. He never confessed, never expressed remorse, and never provided any insight into his twisted psyche.
His silence only adds to the mystery and the pain for the victims' families. They're left to grapple with the unanswered questions, the what-ifs and the whys that may never be resolved.
The impact of Milat's crimes extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families. The case had a profound effect on Australia's tourism industry, particularly backpacker tourism. The fear that a serial killer was targeting young travelers led to a decline in visitors and a shift in the way safety was perceived and addressed.
It's a sad reality that a single individual can have such a devastating impact on an entire industry and a nation's sense of security.
Yeah, it is. It's a stark reminder of the ripple effects of violence, how it can spread outward, touching lives far beyond the immediate victims. But amidst the tragedy and the unanswered questions, there are also lessons to be learned. Milat's case forced law enforcement agencies to reevaluate their strategies for investigating missing persons cases, particularly those involving travelers. It led to improved communication between police departments, enhanced data sharing, and a greater emphasis on public awareness campaigns aimed at educating travelers about the potential dangers of hitchhiking.
So while Milat's crimes were a terrible tragedy, they also served as a catalyst for positive change, leading to improvements in safety measures and a greater awareness of the risks involved in solo travel.
That's a crucial point to remember. Tragedy can sometimes lead to progress, to a collective determination to prevent similar tragedies from happening in the future. And while we can't undo the past, we can honor the memory of the victims by working to create a safer world for all travelers.
That's a powerful message, and one that's worth emphasizing. Milat's case may be closed, but the lessons we've learned from it continue to shape the way we approach traveler safety and the way we think about the darker side of human nature.
Indeed. It's a story that continues to fascinate and horrify in equal measure, a reminder that evil can exist in the most unexpected places and that vigilance and awareness are our best defenses against it.
That's a lot for Simon and Tom to unpack there in their weekly review on Sunday. But in the meantime, tune in tomorrow for another Australian true crime case.